Okay, so our next presenter is Robert H. Langan, who holds a doctorate in psychoanalytic studies from the University of Essex. His book, Jung and Spinoza, Passage Through the Blessed Self, will be available on February 18th via Routledge. A scholar of Jung and Spinoza, he also specializes in speculative metaphysics and psychological types. He lives in southern New Jersey. And the title of Robert or Bob's presentation today is C.G. Jung, the Unlikely Spinozist: How Jung's curious reading of Spinoza betrays the psychiatrist's struggle with inner and outer. Bob, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. And you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So as uh as Phil alluded to, the title concerns Jung's reading of Spinoza, and some of you might be wondering what reading of Spinoza because Jung doesn't talk about him a lot. He mentions Spinoza by name just 7 times in the collected works. And when he does, it's often in a dismissive tone, with the implication that Spinoza is too rationalistic or logical for Jung's liking. At the same time, Jung and Spinoza agree on a number of key topics that are crucial to both of their respective systems of thought. We're going to go over some of those key topics, and we're also going to ask the question why Jung doesn't recognize or perhaps want to recognize the affinity he and Spinoza share. So some background on Spinoza, if you're not familiar, would probably be helpful. Alongside Descartes and Leibniz, he is considered one of the arch rationalist philosophers of the 17th century. Um, Spinoza is most well known for his theory of God, that God is the one substance that all infinite or that all finite things are a part of, the one substance that all finite things are a part of. And this one substance is expressed in 2 different ways: thought and extension, or mind and matter. One of the things Spinoza is trying to do here is he's trying to reject dualism. In other words, the idea that, the mind and the body are separate entities that just somehow interact. But it's important to note that at the same time, he's rejecting any philosophy that tries to reduce mind into matter or elevate matter into mind. The point of Spinoza's monism is that mind and matter, thought and extension, have to be treated as equal expressions of the same whole. Well, we know Jung says something very similar, especially in his mature work. In Mysterium Connuncionis, he talks about the onus mundus, the idea that psyche and matter are 2 forms of the same world. Synchronicity is clearly an example of this. These meaningful coincidences between psyche and matter that can't be explained causally or through any linear, reductive explanation. In more recent times, the physicist and Jungian scholar Harold Atmanspacher has systemized and articulated the dialogue between Jung and Pauli, which was mostly through their letters. And in Atmanspacher's opinion, both Jung and Pauli subscribe to a type of metaphysics called dual aspect monism, which, as you can probably guess, again, is this idea that mind and matter are 2 aspects of the same unitary one. And Atmanspacher points out that, at least in Western thought, the originator of such an idea was Spinoza. But it's not just on the topic of God where Jung and Spinoza agree. Their theories of knowledge and how we learn are strikingly similar. Long story short, both Jung and Spinoza espouse a kind of affect of knowledge where knowledge and affect can't be separated. They're rejecting an intellect that's disembodied and disconnected from things, and both want things on a very visceral level. One way of looking at this is that we can't discuss the ideas we have without also discussing how those ideas make us feel. Feeling and thought are inseparable. Jung also mentions Spinoza alongside with Bergson in his definition of intuition in psychological types. For Spinoza, intuition was the highest form of knowledge. It was the ability to see things from the eye of eternity. The Latin phrase Spinoza uses for this is subspecie eternitatis, And Jung uses that phrase a few times in reference to archetypal knowledge. One such example is in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he's talking about viewing his own life as a mythology in a universal way. Um, to be sure, other philosophers use this term after Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer. But I think one thing that's important to point out here is not only Jung and Spinoza are talking about the same ideas, but Jung is using terms in the way that Spinoza intended them to be used. And to me, this suggests that at least on some level, he has some recognition of Spinoza's philosophy, whether it's directly or indirectly. So again, despite all these similarities, Jung doesn't talk about Spinoza a lot, and when he does, it's often with a negative connotation. In a piece from 2014, Joseph Cambray actually analyzed all 7 passages in Jung's writing where he mentions Spinoza by name, and Cambray notices an interesting trend. What usually happens is Jung will be talking about a concept, and it's a concept that he and Spinoza agree upon, and that's when he'll bring Spinoza in, but he'll characterize Spinoza's opinion and knock him down. And we'll get to an example of that in a second. But the point here is that in Cambray's opinion, this is not just Jung not really knowing Spinoza's philosophy or being totally unfamiliar with him. There's definitely a bit of a negative reaction here. So Cambray posits, well, maybe Jung had a Spinoza complex. I mean, after all, Spinoza was the originator of this monism that Jung and Pauli talk about, and they never credit him for that. Why is there this absence? Why is there this gulf? Cambray says, well, maybe there's some sort of Spinoza complex on Jung's part. The question would be why. So a great example of this double-handed way Jung handles Spinoza is in the phenomenology of the spirit and fairy tales, specifically the opening section where Jung sort of does a historical survey of how the concept of spirit has been used and, in his opinion, misused throughout the ages. And Jung, he criticizes monotheism for ripping spirit away from nature and making it this cosmic governing principle. And at the same time, he chastises materialism in science for reducing it to matter and, in many cases, just outright eliminating it. It's interesting, this whole historical survey, though, he makes Spinoza in many respects the main antagonist. It's by far the most attention he gives Spinoza in his writing, is this opening part of the essay. And he accuses Spinoza of both making spirit this overarching cosmic idealism, but also collapsing it into a dead materialism. Basically, he says Spinoza commits both sins in terms of spirit. Well, why does he do that? To understand that, we have to segue briefly into what spirit exactly is for Jung. Spirit, as he tells Pauli in an exchange of letters from 1953, is, in his opinion, basically all experiences that can't be explained through matter. So, as he says to Pauli, that can be theological concepts, that can be metaphysical concepts, that could be indeed paranormal phenomena. And it also seems to be the contents of the unconscious, such as dreams and archetypal images, so forth. Why is this important? Because in that exchange of letters with Pauli, and indeed in other points in Jung's writing, he basically insists, well, if I am a dual aspect monist, psyche and matter are not the two aspects of my monism. It's really spirit and matter, where spirit is indeed everything immaterial, and matter is all things physical. And psyche, as he insists to Pauli, has to play this role of the neutral medium, the middle third through which all our experiences of spirit and matter pass. Even though the psyche obviously has an ideal component to it, and it shares some sort of relationship with the body, it's in between. And on the nature of the psyche, when he talks about the spectrum of matter, psyche, and spirit, when he's discussing the psychoid aspect of the archetypes, it's the same principle. So in many ways, arguably, Jung's not a dual aspect monist, he's a tripartite monist. Okay, so what does that have to do with our discussion of Jung's critique of Spinoza? Because in the history of thought, Spinoza has been singled out as also offering a middle third between idealism and materialism. Again, for Spinoza, there's only two things. There's God and everything God creates. And that sounds stupid and simple, but when you think about the extreme ramifications of that, there's absolutely no room in his metaphysics for anything else. There's no vacuum. There's God and everything within God, period. And everything that is God and that God creates is just expressed in, well, at least those two ways, as thought and matter, but they're always in the middle between them. So Spinoza also has a neutral medium in his monism, just like Jung does. Another thing that's perplexing about Jung's critique of Spinoza via spirit is that Spinoza never uses the word spirit in the way that Jung reads it into his philosophy rather forcibly. Um, it's not there in the same way that Jung suggests it is. So what is Jung doing? Well, he seems to recognize just as spirit is this aspect of immaterial things in his monism, it's the same thing for Spinoza, where the attribute of thought is all immaterial things for Spinoza's God. So, A, that again affirms that for Jung, spirit plays this role alongside matter, which he's very clear about in that essay, The Phenomenology of Spirit and Fairy Tales. But also, again, he recognizes Spinoza saying the same thing, just with different words, thought instead of spirit. So, again, he's meeting Spinoza at this point. And what's vexing about that essay is after he props up Spinoza as a villain and casts him down, literally in the next paragraph, he concedes, well, spirit and matter may be two aspects of some transcendental being that we're all a part of. He's saying the same thing even after he just distanced himself from Spinoza. And this idea that we all inhere within this pantheism or panentheism, if you want. There's been different terms for it in philosophical literature. Grant Maxwell, a philosopher who's written on Jung, Spinoza, Hillman, uh, puts both Jung and Spinoza in a lineage of thinkers that endorse this kind of transcendental immanence, where all individual things are within this one substance expressed in different ways. Basically, as much as Jung wants to distance himself from Spinoza, they both have this same principle of inhering within the divine. Okay, so why doesn't Jung see this or want to see this? Why doesn't he see that Spinoza, when he's using him in an essay about this very topic, that they really agree, yet he's construing it that they're wildly apart? Is it a poor reading of Spinoza? Did he just not get him? Again, I think he uses enough Spinoza terminology in his writing to dismiss that. I think he had at least some understanding of Spinoza's philosophy. Was it theoretical differences? Indeed, Jung values paradox and the play of opposites in a way that doesn't really exist in Spinoza's philosophy. That's possible. Was it prejudice? Jung's embarrassing opinions about the dangerousness of secular Jews. I mean, that's well documented. Spinoza, in many ways, was the archetypal secular European Jew. Does it just come down to anti-Semitism? And my answer to that is, well, maybe that fashioned Jung an excuse, an objectionable one, to distance himself from Spinoza. But I think a lot of this actually just comes down to theory. And what it comes down to is the different ways that Jung and Spinoza place a premium on the inner world versus the outer world. So without getting too much into the weeds of it, for Spinoza, the connections between other modes of existence, other individuals, is extremely important. So, for instance, let's say my dog barged into the room right now and annoyed me. You know, I like I might a passive effect in Spinoza's definition would be, I get upset about that because I'm in the middle of a presentation. If I have intrinsic connections between things, I might understand, oh, well, she has to go out. I should have taken her out this morning. You start understanding things on a deeper level between yourself and other people or other animals, objects, things, whatever. For Spinoza, you have to find those intrinsic connections between all things. And once you accrue those, you can also understand how things exist in a timeless way as well. And that's the intuition and the eye of eternity that we were talking about. Well, Jung is similar, but at least in a classical take on Jung's theory of learning, it's much more vertical and interiorized. So let's say we have a misunderstanding via projection. I understand the complex in me that might be causing that projection. The projection is withdrawn. I discover the archetypal core at the heart of that complex, and I have access to something divine, but it's purely routed through the interior. And for Jung, this is a bit of an introverted bias because the outer world becomes very much diminished in comparison. Just quickly, one extreme example of this would be, for instance, various women colleagues and clients in Jung's life who he collaborated with, whether it's, Sabina Spielrein, Tony Wolff, and then you might look back at where he mentions their work together later in his writing, and you would think he was just talking to his anima the whole time, and maybe there was some outward vessel where he projected the anima onto, but it becomes a totally interior thing, where the outer world and the people in it don't seem to matter as much. So there's a few reasons for why Jung does this. Mark Sabin talks about how, if you remember at MDR, Jung talks about how he has the number one personality, number two, the number one, of course, the scientist, the everyday careerism, and the number two is more of a timeless mythological side of himself. And Saban talks about how Jung struggled to express that eternal side of himself throughout his life, and that Jung often felt let down when he tried to. So he created a bit of a secret complex, a vow to not betray the sanctity of what he saw his inner world to be. At the same time, we know that Jung is genuinely afraid of paranormal stuff, that he is genuinely afraid of spirit. As he writes to Father White in a letter, I learned what living spirit really is. Don't ask me how I learned. He's likely referring to his confrontation with the unconscious after the Freud breakup. Those two fears of his secret and spirit are kind of entwined, because by protecting the inner world and this access to divine knowledge, Jung is also protecting his knowledge of spirit. And the threat of Spinoza is, for all their similarities, he suddenly has to tear himself inside out. This is out here. His interactions with spirit aren't just intrapsychic. His interactions with anything aren't just intrapsychic. There has to be more things out here that he relates to, and Jung struggles with that. So what's the dilemma with that? We could just accept that's what Jung is. Well, if he doesn't allow for outbound connections, you do have trouble doing interpersonal psychology, which I think post-Jungians have wrestled with and have gone long ways to trying to improve. Um, One way this is done is also to try to even the scales between inner and outer, perhaps to reduce the spiritual valence that Jung offers the interior world, whether that means no longer letting the self be this superordinate cosmic organizing principle, archetypes maybe as social constructs, throwing out synchronicity altogether. The problem with these approaches, at least in my opinion, is that if you get rid of the enchanting aspects of Jung, should we even bother with Jung at that point? Again, these are extreme examples I'm making, but it is a problem when you have a thinker who's very intrapersonal, interpsychic. How do you get him more outbound? Well, one solution through the Spinozist approach is to say, well, we don't have to, let's just abolish the primacy of the interior. Why can't the archetypal be enjoyed by inner and outer alike? And to be fair, I think Jung does take steps in this direction in his mature work. A great example is Psychology of the Transference. This diagram is pretty much aped from that essay, and I'm sure many of you recognize it, where whether it's a therapist and a client, or husband, wife in a heteronormative sense, or whatever it is, yes, there is this vertical tree of knowledge, but also you're interacting with one another on a personal, common level. There's projections through the unconscious, and the collective is affecting both. He's allowing for an interpersonal psychology. And of course, we know, again, as he tells Pauli in 1953, and on the nature of the psyche, that Jung does start distinguishing psyche from spirit. He creates this tripartite monism where psyche is in the middle. Well, what does this let Jung do? It lets him have these great investigations of mass hallucinations and flying saucers, to discuss civilization and the undiscovered self. It lets him excavate intrinsic connections purely in the ideal realm between our own minds and things that exist outside of us. It lets him put things out there. And to wrap this up, this diagram at the bottom is something that Jung sketches to Pauli when he's trying to explain this tripartite monism. And he says matter and spirit are the two aspects, and the psyche is in the middle as this neutral medium. And then there's a transcendental fourth, this God, basically, that is sort of the envelopes everything else. And Jung asked Pauli, it's the age-old question, 3+1, how do we get to 4? Well, I submit that some sort of Spinozism, lets Jung do this, because it allows him to fully remove the psyche, entrench it within something divine and infinite, and then gives him these two aspects of which to play with, matter and spirit. And Jung, even though he would likely hate the term, and a lot of his work, when he adheres to this principle, does become a bit of a consummate Spinozist in a lot of ways. And just a shameless plug to wrap up. As Phil said, the book is out February 18th. You can also follow me on Blue Sky. There's a lot of Jungians on there now. It's becoming a pretty good community, in my opinion. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. I'm going to stop the recording now.